Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined again by Colonel Jacques Baud, a former member of the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service, to shed some light on what is happening in European politics, then especially Europe's relations with Russia and the United States. So welcome back. It's always great to speak with you.
Thank you very much for having me back in your show. Thank you.
So I thought a great place to start is uh, how you see the West's assessment of Putin and Russia, because again, your background as a colonel is from the intelligence services. Your whole point is to understand the opponent or the other side. Um, Yet our journalists they seem to always have a great talent for knowing exactly what Putin is thinking and feeling. But in the real world, we don't actually see that much understanding actually for the Russian position. I was wondering, what is it that you think the West doesn't understand about President Putin and Russia?
You're absolutely right to point out this problem because, first of all, when we talk about intelligence, as you rightly said, I am from strategic intelligence, and strategic intelligence basically uh, helps the political decision makers, I mean, the government basically, to make decisions. And I always considered that strategic intelligence in democratic and countries defined by the rule of law, strategic intelligence is a tool of the rule of law because it should prevent the decision making that is based on intuition, on impression, on individual matters. It should be the purpose of strategic intelligence is to bring the facts to the decision maker so that the decision making is based on objective elements and not on fictitious things. And what we have seen in the last, I would almost say, last 18 years, because I think there's been a change in 2007 after the famous um, uh, uh, mm, speech of Vladimir Putin at the Munich conference. You may remember a security conference that that in fact was a turning point in the way Russia was perceived. And we could see that before 2007, basically, there were a good relation between the East and the West, that the image of Putin in the media was not so bad, was rather positive, in fact, and everything changed then. And from looking at this from a strategic intelligence perspective, I would say there is something wrong in the strategic intelligence apparatuses in Europe, especially, but not only, because how come government may have suddenly a different view on Russia if the assessment is based on facts? The question is slightly different if you look at the press, although the picture that is brought up by the press is the same today as what the strategic intelligence services bring. Uh, the press is, in fact, propagates information. It's it propagates in favor of some groups of interests. It may be right wing press, left wing, and all that. And therefore, you can understand and you may understand that the press may provide a different view, more intuitive, less factually based on, let's say, Russia in our case. The thing is that what we have seen is that the whole press that used to be um, of different opinion, different views on things, suddenly on Russia, they all had the same view. So you had some kind of, within the press itself, an alignment against Russia. And in addition to that, you had this alignment of the Strategic Intelligence Service on with the press as regard Russia. A good example for that is what the French chief of the general staff, the equivalent of the chairman of Joint Chief of Staff in the United States, um, General Burkhardt, who recently made a speech saying that Russia in the 5 years to come will be the most significant threat for Europe, and that Russia has a specific interest on France and wants to target France. And here, from when I listened that as a former strategic intelligence officer, I say, well, but where does it take the information from? Strategic intelligence, as opposed to academics who may develop options and may fantasize on things, even if we can assume that an academic or scholar may have a kind of enlightened assessment, but he may he may guess the future. In strategic intelligence, it's not the case. And that's why strategic intelligence bases its assessments on facts. It may be information gathered by electronic intelligence, signals intelligence, satellite intelligence, and so on and so forth. Because the assessment of strategic intelligence is based on indications, is not a fantasy, is not perception, it's not guesswork, it's based on indications. We have an indication that Russians are prepared for and that they have this intention. We have gathered documents and so on and so forth. So what we have seen recently in Europe is something that goes much beyond the intelligence analysis as such, is fantasy. It's nothing else than fantasy. And that's something that is extremely concerning, not just regarding the situation of Russia, but it's concerning regarding how our government function. The century of the Enlightenment that we had in the 17th, 18th century in Europe was about precisely having governance that was based on facts, based on the analysis, statistical analysis, scientific analysis, political analysis of things, and no longer based on what you had, especially in France. The king was inspired by God, and hence decisions were inspired by God, and therefore you could not discuss that, because discussing a decision was putting God into question. And that's what the Enlightenment brought, in fact. It's a rationality in decision making. And if you read all the writers, especially the French one, like Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Diderot, and so on and so forth, all these writers, philosophers, brought this idea that decision making, public management, governance, political governance must be based on realities and the need of the people, and no longer on fictitious realities and God inspiration and things like that. That at the end is to the benefit of only a minority. So today, what we are seeing is coming back to these times where decisions were based on nothing. And that's as I said, for me, it's a concern for the way our democracies or states work. Again, the rule of law, as the name says, says that the governance is based on strict rules, namely the law, but not only, but also the governance structure and all that. Anyway, it's probably beyond the point to discuss that today. In any case, we have seen this basic change in the approach of decision-making and assessment of the situation. And the problem is that today, everything, and when you read the media, you can see everything is directed almost not just at the at a system, because during the Cold War, and I was in the intelligence in the Cold War, we were struggling or fighting against a system. We didn't want our countries to become communist. Was it right? Was it wrong? We were probably overestimating the willingness of the Soviets to attack Europe, but okay, but that's beyond beside the point at this stage for the purpose of this discussion. In any case, that what was we were fighting against. That we're fighting against a system. We're not fighting against individuals. Today, we are fighting against individuals. And that goes much beyond Putin, because everything you hear about the war in Ukraine, everything that goes wrong or is assessed to go wrong in Ukraine, for instance, or in Russia, is automatically directed at Putin. Putin did wrong. Putin did this mistake. Putin did that. Putin did. And by way of consequence, all those who have a similar, let's say, um, speech as Vladimir Putin are considered as enemies as well, and and that applies to the Russian people as well. Those who support Putin are considered, and that's the reason why the sanctions, for instance, are not directed at Vladimir Putin himself. Probably some are, but most of the sanctions are directed at the Russian population. And this was the idea when you had the start of the special military operation in February 2022. The whole idea was to make Russia to collapse. And to make Russia collapsing, the idea was to destabilize the society and therefore to have a narrative that targets not just the leadership of Russia, but also the population of Russia, in order to create some kind of discontent within the Russian population, and therefore to destabilize the whole system, eventually, if possible, to create uprisings and things like this. That was the idea. And if I'm not inventing, it's not something that I'm making up myself. You can hear what the French Minister of Economy said on the very beginning, the 1st of March 2022. You can find his speech on the radio station Europe 1 in Europe 1 in France. And he said exactly what I just said. The whole idea is to make Russia to collapse and to make the Russian population to suffer. So then from that point, we could see that the whole narrative and the whole perception of Russia was based on this very idea that in order to make Ukraine win or to achieve a defeat of Russia, you have to make Russia, the society, the Russian society, to collapse. And that's why we have 19 sanction packages made by European Union, because that's the whole idea. And everything that has been said, and it's very interesting that in the past years, especially since 2022, but it started even before. You had, since 2021, you had a number of structures that was put in place in Western Europe in order to manage information towards regarding Russia. Of course, you had the NATO Excellence Center for Information that is based in Estonia. But you have other centers that played this game in order to manage the information that comes from Russia and information that is addressed to the European population. And in fact, it's perception management. It's nothing else than this. It's no longer information. And if you read the media, for instance, and I monitor especially the French and the Swiss media, the information they provide is exclusively coming from these institutions. I mean, the Ukrainian institution, because you have institutions that filter the information that comes to the West. Um, nota bene, you have, if you read the Ukrainian press, you have information that is slightly different from the one that Ukraine disseminates in the West. And I made this point in my various books, especially the last one, Covert Wars in Ukraine, because you have really a disinformation structure that has been set in place with UK, US, NATO, and Ukraine, in order to and of course with the Baltic states, and Poland plays a role in that, Germany plays a role in that. You have different countries, but in essence it's UK, US, Ukraine, and NATO. And therefore the information that is provided to the press comes exclusively from these sources. And there is absolutely no other. For instance, just yesterday, you had this Russian strike on Kiev. I mean, in different places, but notably in Kiev. And you had damages to the EU building in Kiev. Well, when you read the French-speaking press and Swiss press, they suggest that the Russian targeted the EU building. But if you read, and again, that's why I say sometimes the Ukrainian press has different information. If you read the Ukrainian media, you will see that the EU representative, it's an ambassador, and this lady said that in fact the European building was damaged by the shock wave produced by other explosions on buildings that were nearby, that were targeted nearby. So the EU building was not targeted. But and she said that explicitly in the Ukrainian media. But if you read the European, Western European media, it suggests that the Russians targeted especially the EU building. So we see that there is a huge distortion of facts that has been made. And of course, we can. In my books, I studied the fact that the issue of the casualties, for instance, and all that, and it's fascinating because today you have all this information that surfaced about these hackers that could take information from the Ukrainian general staff. Found out that there is something like 1.7 million killing and missing in action people. Anyway, we'll not discuss these figures, but in the previous years, there were many information provided by the Ukrainians about the Russian casualties and the Ukrainian fatalities. And you could see that, in fact, what the Ukrainians provided to the West was, in fact, a projection of their own losses. And it was simply inverting the figures. And that appeared in some declaration that has been made by Western leaders, including Ursula von der Leyen, nota bene, because some information leaked in the press showing that, in fact, the real figure of the Ukrainian losses was much higher as what Zelensky said. That was later corrected, but we could see that these leaks were genuine. And in fact, you could see that the figures provided by those leaks were the same as the figures provided for the Russians, officially provided for the Russians, meaning that the Ukrainians used to project their own losses on the figures they provide for the Russians. And I noticed when I made the calculation, also based on the website of Mediazona that probably most people know today, which is an opposition structure or yes, media that is funded by an opponent of Vladimir Putin, by the way, so Khodorkovsky, who is strongly opposed to Vladimir Putin, and he funds this website that, together with the BBC, they make an assessment of the Russian casualties. And when you see the figures that are provided by them, and again, we can argue on the methodology, but at least they have one. Let's say it's not just divine inspiration. They have a methodology. They go and gather information on the social networks and things like this. In any case, they provided figures that are much lower than the one provided by the Ukrainian leadership, and the ratio between what Mediazona is saying and what the Ukrainian are saying is a ratio of between 1 to 10 or 1 to 11, meaning that according to the Ukrainian leadership, the Russians have 10 times more casualties as they normally, I mean, what the Mediazona says. And in fact, if you look at the 1.7 and you look at the figures provided by the Mediazona, you can see that in reality, we have here an inversion. The figures provided by Mediazona is probably correct or close to a reasonable number for Russia. And it's probably the truth, but the Ukrainians have 10 times more. 10 to 11 more times. And in fact, you come roughly to 1.5 million if you go by this kind of rule of the thumb. This is not scientific. These are all estimates. We have to see that with a lot of care. But what I mean is that the figures provided by Ukraine are taken as they are by the Western media without questioning them. Even if Mediazona, again, an opposition media, provides much lower figures. So we see that we have constantly, in fact, fed a narrative. And why that? And that's very important to understand that for the Ukrainians, what makes the sustainability of the Western support is precisely the narrative. And we see that even if you look at the situation on the ground and you compare with the declaration of Ukrainian leaders and, of course, European leaders, you will see a huge discrepancy, because the whole support provided to Ukraine is based on this idea that Ukraine may win. And this idea of Ukraine has successes, and that what everything Russia does is failing and all that. And that's in fact what makes this support, I mean, with quotation mark, sustainable, because if the European citizen would know the reality of the situation, they would probably say, it's useless to continue supporting Ukraine. Therefore, the narrative has become, if you use strategic terminology, I mean, applying Clausewitz, the narrative has become the center of gravity of the Ukrainian strategy towards in this war. Center of gravity is the point or the element or the element from which everything depends. Everything depends on that. If the center of gravity crumbles, all the rest crumbles. And that's the definition of the center of gravity according to Clausewitz. And that's exactly where we are. Now, for the Russians have their center of gravity in the stability of the population, and that's why the reason why the Russians have put a lot of emphasis on the development of the society not simply the military-industrial complex, but also civilian production. I mean, you see EVs and things like this in order to improve. And a recent poll that was made, I think, by the Levada Center in Moscow, which is considered as a foreign agent, by the way, because it's partly funded by the US. In any case, the Levada Center identified that for a lot of Russians, I think it's more than half of the Russians, they have seen their situation improving in the last couple of years, meaning that the Russians have made everything possible in order for the Russian population not to feel the war. And that explains also why the besides the whole narrative that tries to destabilize or show a poor picture of Russia. Besides of this explains why Zelensky said when he started to launch terrorist attack in Russia, and we have seen the various examples, including the spider web a few weeks ago, and so on and so forth. But the idea of Zelensky is to, and he said that explicitly, by the way, that was on the Ukrainian media, very strongly said. He said, we need to make the Russian feel the war, because the whole center of gravity of the Russians was precisely to avoid the Russian citizen to feel the war. And that's why we see that the analysis of the conflict in the West is knowingly and deliberately falsified in order to, in fact, support the sustainability, let's say, yes, with quotation mark again, the sustainability of the support to Ukraine. And everything has been directed at this. Again, the whole, not simply the media, but also the political leadership. When you had, for instance, just last year, just before the Olympic Games in Paris, you had a kind of an epidemic of thumbtacks in French hotels. And in the beds, and this was reported in the media, and that was marked in the media. But what did the government said? They said it was made by the Russians. The Russians brought the thumbtacks So we see that everything is made to create a narrative that is unfavorable to the Russians. But that's not the only thing. I think there is also other aspects that are more probably that have a more subtle impact. For instance, and that affects not just the Western establishment, but also those who are critical toward the European establishment, and even those who support Russia. And if you listen carefully, only few people have a real understanding of why the Russians attacked in February 2022. And even, I mean, I don't want to name people here, but because you have brilliant people who are extremely knowledgeable, but by putting always the emphasis on the issue of NATO, which is definitely a background issue that explains why the Russians are using the conflict today to solve the problem of the NATO enlargement. But the NATO enlargement, it's very important to understand, is not the reason why Russia entered in Ukraine. Because the Russians are extremely legalistic. And regardless of all the lies that have been made by the Western leaders since 1991, and I've written several books on that, on the this whole issue of the NATO enlargement, not an inch towards east, and all these kind of things. These are clear lies that were given to the Russians. But all that is not an excuse. It cannot be used as a legal reason to enter Ukraine. Even if we understand that there is a legitimate concern from Russia to find a way to stop this NATO enlargement, and we see that there's a legitimate concern, but the legal reason to enter Ukraine cannot be that. It is unacceptable, and it would be illegal to attack Ukraine just because NATO is enlarging. By the way, we have to remember that when the Baltic states entered NATO, Russia didn't attack. Russia didn't, or Soviet Union, better said, didn't attack Turkey as it entered NATO in 1952. And although these countries, Turkey in 1952 was bordering directly Soviet Union, and then in the 90s, I mean the early 2000s, the Baltic states were touching the border of Russia, but Russia didn't attack because Russia knows that the issue of NATO must be solved at another level, but it cannot be solved legally by force. And and that's, if you read carefully, the explanation and the reason given by Russia to enter Ukraine in February 22 is not NATO. It is the protection of the population. It's the responsibility to protect under Article 51 of the UN Charter. And you can check that. The Russians have not mentioned NATO as a reason to enter the Ukraine, because they know perfectly that is not a legal reason. But they will use now this opportunity to leverage, they will leverage this conflict to achieve a strategic objective, to put a stop to the NATO enlargement by demanding the neutrality of Ukraine or something like that. We are not on the verge of having those negotiations, or even on the verge of, let's say, we may have those negotiations in the next future. But this is Russia leveraging the conflict to solve this background issue of NATO. But the reason for entering Ukraine was not NATO. And that's the reason why when people say that it's illegal to enter, it was the Russian attack on Ukraine was illegal. Well, those who say that it was the reason for entering Ukraine was NATO are in fact supporting the idea that it's illegal. But it's not the official explanation of the Russian government. So we see that we are in a narrative, the constructed narrative from the West on the one side, but the oversimplified understanding of the conflict by those who support Russia. Both of them have contributed to work adversely against Russia. This is I think something that we need to address at one point. I understand, and I worked 5 years within NATO, and I have been, and I'm still extremely critical about NATO. The very nature of NATO today, probably it had. I understood perfectly the nature of NATO during the Cold War, but since the end of the Cold War, I think NATO missed the opportunity to change its nature and to adjust to the new strategic context of Europe. And in fact, by not understanding that, by sticking to the old intellectual model that we had in 1949, NATO, in fact, is at the root of the problem that we have today in Ukraine. And I understand that, and I'm perfectly. But again, formally, if we look at the justification, and that's why it's extremely important to remind people that the fact that Ukraine started an offensive against the population of Donbass in February 2022 is the reason why Russia entered Ukraine. And this offensive against the Donbass doesn't come out of the blue. It was announced and, in fact, ordered by Volodymyr Zelensky by his decree of the 24th of March 2021. So we know that there was an idea of Ukraine to provoke the war, in fact, because they expected that Russia, and they assessed, in fact, Russia as weaker as it was in reality, and therefore that provoking Russia and provoking a Russian intervention as it happened in 2008 in Georgia, the West would have created the condition for application of extremely brutal and massive sanctions that would make the whole Russia to collapse. That's exactly what Alexei Arestovich explained during an interview at the Ukrainian in media apostrophe on the 18th of March 2019. So we know that the whole process, and again, the problem is that since nobody mentioned that, nobody wants to mention that because a lot of people in the West are opposed to NATO. And again, I'm probably part of those. Uh, but although if I'm probably not extreme as others, but in any case, um, focusing on the issue of NATO tends to distort the real reason why Russia entered, and therefore to make a wrong understanding and a false assessment of the legality of the Russian intervention in. So that's in a nutshell. A big nutshell. Sorry, the issues that are related to our perception of Russia in Europe.
Um, you mentioned this focus on narratives, and well, it is interesting that some of the narratives that gets in the way of the war happens to be happens to be facts, such as the huge losses on the Ukrainian side, or that Ukraine is losing the war, or the brutal recruitment of soldiers in Ukraine, or the very fierce oppression we now see against different groups within Ukraine. All of this kind of undermines a long war because you want the public to continue to support the war. So we're always put in this strange situation where we have to ignore the suffering of Ukrainians to the extent it undermines public support for the war. Indeed, even the vast majority of Ukrainians wanting peace, this is also something that we can't fit in, which is not very attractive to the media. They don't want to mention this because the public might lose support for the war. So there's not that many ways to explain this, of course, than narrative control and perceptions to keep the war going. But I recently spoke with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and he was making the point that he had spoken with Macron, and Macron had said that in the private that, well, of course, this is about NATO expansion. This is what Russia's reacting to, among other things. But in public, he denies it. So, and this comes often a common trait that the politicians say one thing in public, which they do not say at all in private. So, I'm wondering how much is the rationality issue among the European leaders, because I can assume everyone can get captured by ideology and narratives, but sometimes it just appears to be deception as well. I'm not sure how you look at this.
Absolutely right. I completely agree with you. Take the example of the NATO membership, for instance. In March 2022, Volodymyr Zelensky gave an interview to CNN. And in that interview, he said that he asked Joe Biden whether Ukraine would be member of NATO, yes or no. And he says in the interview that the answer was no. Ukraine will not be member of NATO, but for the open information, I mean, for the public opinion, we'll keep the door open. That's exactly what he says in the meaning that the whole discussion that was March 2022. I mean, the whole discussion about the membership, and at every summit, at the end of every summit, or they reaffirm that Ukraine will be member of NATO, and they don't know who and when, and because there is still no action plan for that. But in any case, Ukraine will be member of NATO. There is no discussion about it. It's just a question of time and things like. But in reality, we know that it will not be the case. So meaning that you have exactly the example you mentioned with Emmanuel Macron. You have everybody realizes that the war is lost. Everybody realizes that the whole issue of Ukraine, member of NATO, and things like that, this is lost. But they continue to say, and there is a little bit of the so-called sunk cost syndrome there. That means that we have invested so much in a project, the project is failing, but since we have invested so much, we keep investing in it because otherwise all would be lost. And experience, I mean, not just political in the political area, but even if you have in an enterprise or in industry, if you have such a project, you invest and you see it's failing, continuing feeding that project is just another way of losing money. You just, as soon as you notice that it's failing, you should stop funding that project, period. And that should have been exactly the same with Ukraine. The problem is that we are talking about people, namely Emmanuel Macron and others. They make a war against Russia with the blood of the Ukrainians. It's not the French blood. It's not the British blood. It's not the German blood. It's not the Polish blood. It's Ukrainian blood. So nobody cares about them. And in fact, the mere fact that we are funding or continuing to support a war that is clearly failing is just a way, and I'm very sad to say it that way, because I have many Ukrainian friends, and I met a lot of Ukrainian friends when I was working in NATO at that time. But the reality is that the Europeans don't care for the Ukrainians. They are just using Ukrainians as a cannon fodder to fight Russia. The difference is just they just hate the Russians more than the Ukrainians. We can put it that way. Because if they had any respect for Ukraine, they would have tried to find a solution before. I remind you that you had, before Russia started to change strategy and adopted a strategy of attrition in October 2022, before that, you had 3 attempts of Ukraine to solve the problem diplomatically. It started on the 25th of February 2022. You had on the mid-March 2022, and then in August 2022. On 3 occasions, the Ukrainians proposed political solutions. On the 3 occasions, the Russians agreed to engage a process to have a political solution. On the 3 occasions, the Europeans stopped the process. So we see that even if the Ukrainian decide to solve the problem, we just prevent them to do so. And a friend of mine, who was the Swiss ambassador in Kiev up to last year, in fact, so he had been ambassador during the whole crisis there. I mean, the crisis since 2021 or something like that, up to last year. And he said in an interview on the Swiss TV, he said we should let the Ukrainians to decide by themselves what they want. That was in November 2022. But in fact, what he's not saying is that on 3 occasions on that year, the Westerners, especially European Union, I mean the Europeans basically, stopped the Ukrainians as they engaged into a diplomatic solution of the problem. The Europeans don't want a and we see that today, by the way, the same thing. We have Trump. Again, we can discuss the sincerity of Trump, the effectiveness of Trump, and all that. We can discuss all this. But the fact of the matter is that Trump is trying to find a solution on the negotiation table. Who opposed that? Europeans. I mean, now the Ukrainians have been emboldened by the European position, so they refuse. But this is something that goes. I don't have an explanation for that besides the sunk costs fallacy syndrome and things like this, and of course the fact that the major leaders in Europe are also leading their country with a strong opposition in their own country. And we see that in France, UK, Germany. I mean, those large countries have all a huge opposition against them. So probably they don't want to show any weakness in their position, and therefore they continue to go on that desperate way because they don't want to show any weakness. That's also a possible explanation. But here we are entering an explanation that is no longer political or rational or strategic. We are in the area of psychiatry or, and psychological disorder. We are in this order of the order of things.
Well, I thought about the sunk cost idea as well in the past because if we hadn't gone this deep in, I think we would have been rethinking what we're doing, given that this war can't be won, and we're betting everything now, it seems, on losing proposition. So, but my last question was therefore, how long can we continue to double down on failure? Because we're seeing now headlines that there's huge economic problems, that is both the United Kingdom and France maybe moving towards some IMF bailout. Germany isn't looking too great itself. Of course, a lot of this translates into very diminished political strength of the political elites. They're very low in the polls. In France, they have the solution to arrest Le Pen. In Germany, the solution appears to be to ban the AfD. It's and of course there are stenographers in the media who's repeating uncritically all their war narratives. People are losing trust in them in a very, very, very quickly. So it seems a lot of this can't really go on forever. And of course, then you have the front lines, which are falling at increasingly faster pace. So one gets the impression that we are reaching the end of the game here, and still when a peace proposal is suggested, it's about immediate ceasefire so we can put in European troops and the Russians can pay reparation, trillion euros. This is just, it doesn't make any sense. So I was wondering how long do you think this can go on before something crack? And indeed, everything is not that great in the United States. And of course, on top of this, we have other conflicts, the Middle East, possibly with China, and we have a possible economic crisis breaking out in the United States. So with all of this uncertainty, all these different variables, one assumes that we are reaching the end game here, though.
The thing is that it's very unfortunate for Ukraine, in fact, because the more desperate the situation is in Europe, the more there will be this idea from the leaders to distract the population from the domestic problem and to focus put more focus on the Ukrainian conflict, and therefore making the situation impossible by increasing the demands or having absurd demands towards Russia, like reparation and all that. All the issue of the frozen assets, Russian assets, and all this contributes to distract the population from the real problems in the domestic in the countries themselves. And that serves the Russians because the Russians now they are grinding down the Ukrainian army. We know that the Russians will certainly not go beyond the Dnieper in the northern part of the country, but they may contemplate the idea of retaking Odessa, for instance, or taking Odessa. And that, I mean, the longer we keep this conflict alive, the more likely we make this that the Russians may be in a position to take Odessa and the southern part of the country. So we see that even this irrational, or maybe there's a distorted rationale behind the European position or posture, because, as I said, they just want to focus on an external conflict instead of domestic problems. But the problem is that on the ground, regardless of how you assess the situation and how you assess whether the Russians are good or bad, the fact of the matter is that the Russians are moving forward. They are progressing on the ground. They are destroying the Ukrainian asset. It may take time, but so they can preserve lives of their own soldiers. They are using missiles. They are using all different assets. They are also creating a situation within Ukraine that is adverse to the authorities, and we see a growing opposition to Zelensky. Um, this reflects in also all the intelligence that the Russian receives from inside Ukraine in order to strike with missiles and drones in the depth of the Ukrainian territory, because most of the information that the Russians have to strike all those small factories, the Ukrainians have scattered all the drone factories and armament factories and all that. All that has been hidden in basements of buildings, in even in apartment buildings and things like this. But now we can see that the Russians can strike very precisely those small factories and things like that. And that is a kind of information that can be only provided by insiders, meaning people, Ukrainian themselves, meaning that this opposition to Zelensky is materialized by this intelligence support to the Russians. And that is increasing so. Therefore, we see that everything we try to delay the time, a negotiation on the conflict goes to the benefits to the Russians, and that's exactly what's happening. So again, there is no rational in that. If you would make a rational assessment of the European position, regardless of sunk cost fallacy and all this kind of thing, the European would have been better inspired to press Ukraine to negotiate as soon as possible. But now we are in something different. Again, I cannot rationally explain that, to be honest. There is no, in my view, there is no rational explanation, um, because all analysis you have, and I assume that despite the fact that when we see those intelligence agency providing reports, and that applies to the Swiss intelligence, by the way, because if we read their regular uh, assessment on the situation, we see that this assessment follows exactly the Ukrainian narrative. I mean, the official narrative of the West, which is quite strange because if you're following the situation based on the very facts that are available on the net, you can assess that the situation is turning in favor of Russia, but it's not their assessment. In any case, uh, there is something, probably some kind of intellectual corruption within the intelligence services. I mean, it cannot be explained otherwise. In any case, we are now pushing Ukraine into a situation where there will be an end of the conflict, but this end will be, in fact, a blatant and decisive victory of Russia. That's where we are heading to. And I don't see any sign that the European leadership at large, I mean, at the level of the European Union, certainly, but also at the level of individual countries, I don't see that people have realized this, with the exception of the Hungarians. I mean, Hungary has, I think, probably the best assessment on the situation, at least officially. Um, so we are heading towards the defeat of Ukraine, and there will be a point where defeat will be a fact. So today you can probably play with words and play with image and showing a destroyed Ukrainian tank and say it's a Russian one, or vice versa, and so on. But there will be a point where this will no longer be possible, and we are closing to this point.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, Orban recently said that the war had already been lost. I think that's correct. But as you said, I think will be very obvious to everyone kind of soon. But so far, they trying to look the other way. So yeah, thank you for your comments. Indeed, who better to speak with than a former colonel in the intelligence to understand why we have deviated so far from the reality. So thanks again.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.